Good morning, everybody. Hi, everybody on the screen. Good to see you. This morning we're reading two readings, one from Jeremiah and one from Luke, and we're going to kind of read them in pieces as we go along. So if you want to join me, I invite you to. Those who are here, we're going to start on the bottom right-hand corner of page 1233 in your pew Bible. Stick Jeremiah 34:8 into your phone app if that's your style. But we're going to start with Jeremiah 34, verses 8 through 10. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord after King Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people in Jerusalem to make a proclamation of liberty to them, that all should set free their Hebrew slaves, male and female, so that no one should hold another Judean in slavery. And they obeyed. All the officials and all the people who had entered into the covenant that all would set free their slaves, male or female, so that they would not be enslaved again, they obeyed and set them free. This is the word of the Lord. What an appropriate text, right? For today, for the 19th of June, the day we have come to know as Juneteenth, commemorating June 19th, 1865. The day, a year and a half after the Emancipation Proclamation had become law, and 2 months after the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee that brought the Civil War to an end, when Union Major General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, with the news that all enslaved people were indeed free. The first observances of Juneteenth were celebrations with lots of food, church services, of course, and gatherings of family. Sometimes Juneteenth gatherings were used as opportunities to teach formerly enslaved and disenfranchised people about their rights, or were devoted to genealogy, the kind of record keeping and knowledge about family relationships that slavery had obliterated. They were defiant opportunities to remember the sweetness of those liberating words of Major General Granger in that moment when the good news of slavery's end finally made its way to the last corner of what was then the United States. For Jeremiah and the people of Jerusalem in this morning's reading, the idea of freeing slaves was not new. Throughout the Old Testament, in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, God includes the freeing of enslaved people in the description of how the Israelites should honor the Sabbath. The people should have a weekly day for rest, just like God rested on the seventh day in the creation story. But God also instructed the people that every seventh year should be a kind of reset. No crops farmed, no livestock raised, and slaves should be released. The idea of liberation, built on the foundational act of God's liberation of God's people from slavery in Egypt, was baked into the core of faithful communal life right from the start. But sometimes, it seems, things went sideways. So if we continue reading, Jeremiah 34, verse 11, But afterward, they turned around and took back the male and female slaves they had set free and brought them again into subjection as slaves. Guys, we were so close to being faithful, to doing what was right. The taint of sin that just always seems to get in the way, doesn't it? Let's keep reading in verse 12. The word of the Lord came again to Jeremiah. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I myself made a covenant with your ancestors when I brought them out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, saying, every seventh year, each of you must set free any Hebrews who have been sold to you and have served you 6 years. You must set them free from your service. But your ancestors did not listen to me or incline their ear to me. You yourselves recently repented and did what was right in my sight by proclaiming liberty to one another. And you made a covenant before me in the house that is called by my name. But then You turned around and profaned my name when each of you took back your male and female slaves, whom you had set free according to their desire, and you brought them again into subjection to be your slaves. Therefore, thus says the Lord, you have not obeyed me by granting a release to your neighbors and friends. I am going to grant a release to you, says the Lord, a release to the sword, to pestilence, and to famine. I will make you a horror to all of the kingdoms of the earth. Just like the ancient Israelites, we so rarely get things right. And as much as it means to commemorate this day as a national holiday, the memory of June 19th, 1865 is not quite as cleanly celebratory as we might hope. An entire year and a half after the Emancipation Proclamation, months even after the end of a war fought over the states' rights to condone slavery for the economic benefit of the most wealthy, how was it that there were enslaved people who still didn't know that they were free? Well, I mean, when you think about it, it's not really that hard to imagine, is it? Losing the slave labor that kept plantations running was a huge economic hit for slave owners, not to mention having the fair market value of these human beings suddenly removed from the asset column in their ledgers. Texas in 1865 was kind of the outer edge of the United States, and as such it was a haven to those who were hoping to avoid both the violence of the war and the consequences of its outcome. It's estimated that in 1860, there were maybe about 1,000 enslaved people living in Texas. But by 1865, after 4 years of the Civil War, there were more than 250,000 enslaved people living in Texas. Yeah, I can imagine there would have been more than a few people who might have had a motive to keep mum on the news that slavery had ended. In General Order Number 3, which you can actually go see in the Texas State Archives today, Major General Gordon Granger wrote, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness, either there or elsewhere." A painful part of my own family history is that I am the descendant of a slaveholder. My great-great-granddaddy Beard, the story is told, was so kind to the slaves on his Mississippi farm, such a generous and Christian master, that when the slaves were freed, his chose to stay. What kind of a choice was that? With orders like the one General Granger wrote, literally instructing slaves to stay, never mind if they had children or spouses or parents or loved ones who had been sold away from them, telling them they wouldn't be allowed to be seen loitering in public. Where were these new freed men supposed to go? What were they supposed to do? Now that they were being blamed for the economic hardship of farmers, who would have hired one of them in this kind of environment, no matter what kind of job they would have found? And imagine having no personal savings, no family belongings to go out and start a life. They chose to stay. Yeah, sure. The calm assurance and the erasure of the perspective of formerly enslaved people with which this story has been told in my family and in our American family in so many variations is the same kind of infinitely flexible, persistent evil that became Plessy v. Ferguson, the decision in 1896 that separate and equal would be fine, that led to segregation and the rule of terror that was the Jim Crow South. It's the same kind of infinitely flexible, persistent evil that became enshrined in the Constitution's 13th Amendment, that abolishes slavery and indentured servitude except as punishment for a crime, which today looks like mass incarceration in for-profit prisons that are grossly disproportionately filled with African Americans. It's the same kind of infinitely flexible, persistent evil that filled the heart of a young white man who opened fire in a Black community's grocery store in Buffalo just over a month ago, that knelt on the neck of George Floyd as he gasped for his mother, catalyzing a newly energized movement to honor this day, Juneteenth, the day the good news of freedom came, and a moment when we saw God's justice triumph over evil. Just as God commanded God's people to remember that they too had been enslaved and so should honor the Sabbath and free their siblings from bondage, and just as they failed over and over again to do so, Juneteenth is for us a reminder of both the sweetness of the good news of freedom and the persistent presence of sin in our broken human community. We have seen the consequences that God promised to Jeremiah and his community. We have been wrecked by violence, illness, hunger, a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. Even as Juneteenth prompts us to reflect on how far we've really come, to recommit ourselves to dismantling systemic racism, we can't help but wonder, is there really any hope for us? Maybe. Join me if you'd like in Luke chapter 4. This is page 1597 in your Pew Bible. Luke 4, verses 31 through 37. Jesus went down to Capernaum, a city in Galilee, and was teaching them on the Sabbath. They were astounded at his teaching because he spoke with authority. In the synagogue there was a man who had the spirit of an unclean demon, and he cried out with a loud voice, "Let us alone! What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." When the demon had thrown him down before them, he came out of the man without having done him any harm. They were all amazed and kept saying to one another, "What kind of utterance is this? For with authority and power he commands the unclean spirits, and out they come." And a report about him began to reach every place in the region. This summer, as Jen mentioned, we're going to engage a summer-long study of the biblical concept of the Sabbath. And as you can maybe already tell from what we've talked about today, the Sabbath God commands us to take in the Bible is a lot more than just a day without working. Jesus, and we'll talk about this more this summer, often got in trouble for doing things he wasn't supposed to be doing on the Sabbath, like in this example, healing, a form of work. But in doing so, he was pointing back to the deep meaning of the seventh day of the creation story, the day when God rested, delighting in all that was good. Did you catch what the demon said to Jesus as he cast it out? "Leave us alone. Have you come to destroy us?" Have you come to destroy us? It could have been the words of slaveholders in Texas on June 19th, 1865, in response to the words of General Granger. It could have been the words in the mouths of white supremacists marching with tiki torches. The stories are different, but the refrain of the voice of evil is the same in all of them. And the power with which Jesus can rebuke this evil remains the same as well, continually calling us to remember the joy for which God made this world and our role as the bearers of good news. This Juneteenth, the second year that we're celebrating this day when the good news of freedom arrived as a federal holiday, the good news of liberation continues to ring out. Despite every evil attempt, Black Americans continue to persist, to flourish in love and community and joy. Despite every evil attempt, Jesus continues to proclaim freedom from the power of sin and death, inside our own hearts and within the systems and structures that human beings have built. He wields the power to drive out every kind of evil and has commissioned us as his hands and feet. Unlike Major General Granger, the message of freedom we have been called to carry has no limits, no caveats, but paints a new and expansive vision for reformed ways of living. This Juneteenth, God calls us into a Sabbath practice of resting from injustice, resting from all the ways we have been taught to divide and malign each other, grounded in the memory of the sweetness of freedom for our ancestors in faith when God rescued them from slavery in Egypt, grounded in the memory of the sweetness of the good news of liberation finally arriving in Galveston, Texas on June 19, 1865. May the sweetness of this freedom be our calling, our work, and our future. Amen.